The IDF is preparing for an offensive, as assessments of the situation underground in the Gaza Strip points out to a return of maneuvering of our forces, possibly as soon as next month. Military pressure certainly is doing its work, as the IDF eliminated 5 terrorists who tried to escape from the tunnels in Rafah over the past 24 hours, and Hamas agreed to hand over the remains of another hostage. However, the release was once again conducted in a fake and staged victory ceremony, while Hamas runs to cry to the mediators about a so-called Israeli violation of this agreement. Qatar also got involved because of Hamas, as the negotiations over Gaza are moving up a level behind the scenes, so we will bring you all the truth about the dramatic meeting in Cairo of the mediators, the farce of the international force, and Israel's growing assessment that there is no choice but to dismantle Hamas alone. However, the United States is advancing the plan to build residential compounds in Gaza, and in Europe, they fear a de facto division of the Gaza Strip. In the north, we will bring you all the details of who the Hezbollah chief of staff Haitham el-Tabtabi was and why it was important to eliminate him very quickly. He was not just another terrorist operative, but rather, he was the most experienced and dangerous commander remaining in the Hezbollah terrorist organization. He was busy passing on what he learned and experienced, and he was also planning a specific terrorist attack when he was eliminated. Now, the question remains of who will replace him at the top of the Hezbollah terrorist organization. But there's one question that we already know the answer to, and it's about which side the United States will be on. There is already a United Nations demand to investigate Israel's airstrikes in Lebanon, and we'll have to see where that goes. Another event that should surprise no one is that Iran has threatened to retaliate against Israel for this strike, with officials in Tehran declaring that the strike will be severe and painful. However, there was a small surprise out of Iran this week, as Iranian officials are now saying that the Houthis in Yemen went out of control and are trying to wash their hands off them. Nevertheless, the truth is that the Houthis are preparing for another attack. In international news, the British are shocked after locally made components reached an Iranian nuclear company, and in the United States, the Muslim Brotherhood is outraged after President Trump's announcement. Did he manage to dismantle the 100-year plan? And is this the end of the jihad war in America? Welcome to Boots on the Ground. I'm your host, Yair Pinto, bringing you all the truth about what is happening in Israel. So let's go over all our headlines for today. Despite the United Nations Security Council resolution, Israeli officials assess that the return to maneuvering in the Gaza Strip is closer than Hamas voluntarily disarming and may happen within weeks. Hamas also seems to think that this is a possibility, and under this pressure, they announced the handover of the remains that were recovered recently that are believed to be of a hostage who was murdered in captivity in Gaza. After the announcement by the Prime Minister's office this week, in which Israel demanded the immediate delivery of the 3 fallen hostages held in the Gaza Strip, the recovered remains were transferred to the Red Cross and returned to Israel on Tuesday evening. They were then sent onto the forensic lab for analysis to make sure that they actually belonged to the hostage. And meanwhile, the pressure on Hamas terrorists who are in the tunnels in Rafah continues. And 2 days after the army said that the terrorist supplies are running out, 5 of them were eliminated after they apparently came up from the underground in Rafah. So far, 22 have been captured or terminated above ground. In addition, a terrorist who tried to cross the yellow line was terminated. However, on the ground, the data shows a bleak view indicating Hamas's return to almost full control of the Gaza Strip. Senior IDF officials are now saying that we need our own plan for the demilitarization of Gaza because the Trump plan is not working. Speaking of President Trump's plan, the United States is advancing the establishment of residential compounds for Palestinians in parts of the Gaza Strip that are under Israeli control. The aspiration is to allow Palestinians to rehabilitate far from Hamas, but elements in Europe feel the implications for Israeli control on this territory. In the northern arena, the elimination of the second-in-command of Hezbollah, Chief of Staff Ali Tabtabi, raises again the big question of who remains in the command echelon at this point. What is also unclear is what effect this will have on the plans that Hezbollah had to recruit thousands of new operatives and the new methods that Tabtabi was using. Hezbollah has been trying very hard to rehabilitate himself over the past year and have managed to replace more than 2,500 gunmen that this organization had lost in the war with Israel. So we will bring you all the details about who the Hezbollah chief of staff was and why it was important to eliminate him very quickly. And in a related story, the United Nations is once again supporting terrorists. The Human Rights Commission, which has largely ignored Hezbollah's military buildup, is now requesting a rapid and independent inquiry into the strike in Ain el-Hilawa and the other Israeli strikes designed to push back Hezbollah. For its part, Israel is increasing the pressure to dismantle Hezbollah from its weapons after the elimination of Haytham Tabtabi. TBN Israel senior Middle East analyst Mati Shoshani will bring us all the details on the power plays in the Middle East. And this is against the background of the release of the fallen hostage, a senior delegation of mediators from Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey that met in Cairo this week to discuss implementing the second stage of the Gaza ceasefire. So elements familiar with the Gaza issue are skeptical that the stabilization force will be established and describe the American difficulty in composing it. Azerbaijan, which was one of the bright spots in this plan, has withdrawn their offer to send troops to the International Stabilization Force, so that the assessment is that in the end, Israel will have to dismantle the organization's weapons itself. In addition, Mati will take us through Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's deep and troubling involvement in the continuation of the Trump plan in Gaza and his entrenchment in Syria, the non-legal distribution of weapons, and Israel's red lines. And it turns out that the outwardly friendly meeting in the White House between President Donald Trump and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman masked some deep tensions behind closed doors, mostly centered around the question of normalizations with Israel. Bin Salman said that the public opinion in Saudi Arabia is anti-Israeli and therefore he cannot join the Abraham Accords, leaving Trump disappointed and angry. Elsewhere, there were fresh threats against Israel by Iranian officials this week. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps responded to the elimination of Hezbollah's chief of staff, Haytham Tabtabi, with their standard rhetoric about how the response will be so painful. Guys, we're still waiting for the pain from literally dozens of other threats that came out of the Islamic Republic of Iran against Israel. But we'll see if they follow through with that. We're ready. However, we also have to admit that despite its strikes in Yemen over the past year, Israel has not succeeded in creating a deterrence equation vis-à-vis the Houthis in Yemen. The combination of the ceasefire on the one hand and an intensified Iranian presence in Yemen's capital on the other hand may indicate that the Houthis are not resting on their laurels, and they are also seeking to prepare for the next round of fighting against Israel. However, a report this week in the British news portal The Telegraph indicated and quoted that a senior Iranian official was indicating that the regime is losing both interest and the control in the Yemeni proxy, the Houthi terrorist organization. This is happening while the Shiite militias in Iraq are also beginning to act more independently without orders from Iran. Finally, United States President Donald Trump and his plan to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization has the organization in an uproar, wondering if their 100-year plan to turn America into an Islamic state is now over. What's happening now in the United States is not a one-off phenomenon. It is a slow and belated response to the Muslim Brotherhood's methods that was built over 3 decades, including the careful construction of educational infrastructure, communities, institutions, campuses, associations, international funding, and community projects, all designed to lead to cultural, political, and legal influence. So we have a lot to talk about today, so let's dive into the details. I'm Yair Pinto, with me is Mati Shoshani, and this is your Boots on the Ground report about what's happening in Israel in this war against Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, the Shiite militias in Iraq, and all the other armed groups in this region that are taking their orders from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards, which is the head of the crumbling axis of evil in the Middle East. Just a moment before we begin, I'm calling on you to help us spread the truth by sharing our content with as many people as possible, especially with influencers and elected officials. Leave a comment on these videos and hit like, and most importantly, look for the subscribe button, click on it. That way you can help us reach more people with our boots on the ground reports. We'll start today's report with a look at what's happening in the Gaza Strip as the pressure in eastern Rafah is continuing. On Tuesday, 5 armed terrorists were identified and eliminated in the area of the underground terror infrastructure in which Hamas operatives are trapped and, according to the frontline reports, are beginning to break. Meanwhile, during the day, several incidents were recorded in which the IDF acted against Gazans who crossed the yellow line. According to the IDF statements, the Nahal Brigade's combat team forces continue to operate in the eastern part of the Rafah area. And earlier, during the searches in the area, 5 armed terrorists were identified and terminated. The army said this past Saturday that 17 terrorists who tried to escape from the tunnels in the area beyond the yellow line in the eastern part of the city were eliminated or arrested. In Gaza City, a car containing the head of the operations divisions in the armament array of the El-Qassam brigades, Abu Abdallah el-Hadidi, as well as some of his henchmen, was identified and then eliminated. In eastern Rafah area, a network of several underground routes remains in which dozens of Hamas terrorists have been entrenched for months now. The security forces are concentrating efforts in eastern Rafah and in the Janina neighborhood to destroy the underground routes and eliminate the terrorists that are staying in them. The IDF warns that the fate of the terrorists trapped in the routes is surrender or elimination. However, Hamas continues to entrench its rule in the Gaza Strip area under its control and to ignore the determination that it must disarm. The warning from the defense establishment that was heard in recent days in the cabinet is that Hamas is growing stronger, rehabilitating its capabilities, and returning to almost full control of the Gaza Strip west of the yellow line. 13 municipalities out of 25 have returned to full activity. Police and checkpoints have been deployed once more, and Hamas is repairing significant infrastructure and rehabilitating its public image amongst the people in the Gaza Strip. One senior IDF official said, "One cannot ignore that Hamas is strengthening and rehabilitating its capabilities in Gaza. Israel needs to build an independent operational plan for the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip because the American plan does not provide an answer for all of this." The assessment in Israel is that the IDF is closer to returning to maneuvering in the Gaza Strip than to the possibility of the murderous terrorist organization Hamas that will voluntarily decide to disarm. One official said, "Looking right now at the defense establishment's view of everything that's currently happening in the Gaza Strip, the understanding is that at the present, there is no one on the other side with whom it is even possible to work because Hamas controls everything on its side of the yellow line. And furthermore, Hamas does not intend to leave the Gaza Strip, and this is also the message that is being conveyed upward to the political echelon." And the official added that there is also a very clear dialogue with the Americans who are struggling to find the country that will contribute soldiers who will enter the Gaza Strip to handle the disarmament of Hamas. However, the Americans are still not throwing up their hands and are not saying despair, and are leaving a window of a few weeks during which perhaps the 3 remaining fallen hostages held by Hamas will be returned to Israel. If these things do not come together, and Hamas does not say in its own voice that it intends to dismantle the weapons and leave the Gaza Strip, there will be no choice and the IDF will likely have to return and complete the job itself. The official added that the IDF is already preparing for such an option, and the political echelon also understands that this is probably the option right now with the highest likelihood of succeeding. The goal at this moment is to give at least 2 to 3 weeks to give a last chance to the ceasefire agreement. And in the United States and in Israel, people are beginning to understand that there is no entity that will take upon itself the elimination of Hamas. Without the elimination of Hamas, there is no Trump plan, and therefore the green light has been given to begin planning for the return of military operations, and the elimination of Hamas is closer than ever. In related news, after the announcement by the Prime Minister's office this week, in which Israel demanded the immediate delivery of 3 fallen hostages held in the Gaza Strip, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad announced at noon on Tuesday that they would deliver one of the fallen at 4 p.m. In the announcement by the Prime Minister's office, it was stated that Israel views with severity the delay in delivering the findings after the Palestinian Islamic Jihad reported locating remains of a fallen hostage earlier in the week. It was also noted that this is an additional violation of the agreement and that Israel demands the immediate return of the 3 fallen hostages that are still in the Gaza Strip. As promised, a coffin containing the remains that were found was delivered to the Red Cross on Tuesday afternoon, and the Red Cross transferred the coffin to an IDF force in the Gaza Strip, and a little after 7 in the evening, it arrived at the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Abu Kabir. And here at TBN Israel, we will continue to update you with any new information on the matter, and as always, we invite you to be part of the team by sharing our videos on YouTube, following us on social media, leaving a comment on these videos, and above all, clicking the subscribe button and praying for the peace of Jerusalem. Now, I want to speak to you for just a moment about one of our partners. As 2025 comes to a close, Israel's people still need you more than ever. Nearly 2 years after this war broke out, families are still displaced, soldiers are still defending the homeland, and millions are struggling to make ends meet. Meir Panim is standing in the gap by feeding the hungry, supporting Holocaust survivors, caring for teens at risk, and lifting up the brave men and women of the IDF. This year alone, they have served more than 2.6 million meals, supported over 100,000 IDF soldiers, delivered 500,000 care packages, and helped thousands of families rebuild their lives. But the need is still great. There is still tens of thousands of displaced families, and around 2.6 million Israelis are living in poverty as more than 1 million children go to bed hungry each night. This is your moment to make a difference. Every dollar provides hope, dignity, and real help to those who need it most. So please visit bless-israel.org and give generously today. Again, that's bless-israel.org. Together, we can bless Israel's people in their hour of need. Now, we're getting back into the news and switching our focus to the northern arena. Over the past year, since the ceasefire in the north took effect, Hezbollah Chief of Staff Haytham El-Tabtabi has been engaged in rehabilitating and rebuilding the terrorist organization. According to a report this week in the Wall Street Journal, this was the main reason for his elimination at the beginning of the week in an IDF strike on a safe house in the Dakhya neighborhood in Beirut in an operation dubbed Black Friday. For the person defined as second in command of the terrorist organization, there were many rules, but the journal emphasized his importance to Hezbollah's efforts not to disarm, despite the decision by the Lebanese government on this issue. Under the ceasefire agreement with Israel, Lebanon is to dismantle Hezbollah's weapons south of the Litani River, and later, the organization is supposed to give up its weapons also north of the river. However, the terrorist organization opposes this, claiming that the weapons are necessary to defend Lebanon's sovereignty. As part of this refusal, and in parallel to the IDF's unceasing activity in Lebanon, Hezbollah constantly works to smuggle weapons and at the same time tries to recruit operatives to its ranks. Tabtabi was described as a decisive component in these efforts, and beyond that, as one of the most senior figures remaining in the organization's ranks after a series of eliminations during the war. He took responsibility for Hezbollah's military activities. Official sources in the Arab world said that Tabtabi focused on strengthening the organization forces in southern Lebanon, precisely where Hezbollah is supposed to disarm. He also ordered the terrorists to operate in small cells with the aim of improving their chances of survival in a future confrontation against Israel. Remember that during the war, Hezbollah was hit very hard, and beyond the many senior officials who were eliminated, including the organization's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, the terror organization also lost more than 2,500 armed operatives who participated in the fighting in various ways. According to officials and official sources in Israel and also in Arab countries, Tabtabi's efforts succeeded and the terrorist organization managed to replace the thousands of operatives that it had lost in this war. Tabtabi's last mission, which he was engaged in at the time that he was eliminated, also directly concerns Hezbollah's rehabilitation efforts. Official Arab sources told the Wall Street Journal that he worked to implement a new systematic method in the organization's ranks based on lessons learned in the past war. He also led the efforts to resist disarmament, strengthening southern arrays, establishing covert infrastructure, gathering intelligence, and a dispersed deployment of operatives in order to increase survivability in a future confrontation with Israel. Arab sources emphasized that he was decisive in the organization's ability to restore significant manpower, but he won't be doing that any longer. Although Hezbollah has so far not responded militarily to Tabtabi's elimination, Israeli and Arab intelligence indicates that the terrorist organization continues its rehabilitation attempts, which include renewing its stock of rockets and anti-tank missiles. The journal noted that some of the weapons reached Lebanon in shipments by sea and are also smuggled via Syria, despite Israel disrupting some of the smuggling routes. Something else that is notable about the recent events is the absence of Hezbollah's Secretary General, Naim Qassem, from Tabtabi's funeral in Beirut this week. Qassem has not even released a statement since Sunday, but he is expected to speak this coming Friday at 6 p.m. in the evening at an event in honor of Tabtabi and the other operatives that were eliminated in the strike. Hezbollah has not explicitly threatened the response, and a figure close to the terrorist organization told the French news agency AFP that there are two opposing opinions inside the organization. There are those who want to respond to the assassination and those who prefer to refrain. For now, the organization's leadership prefers the diplomatic path. But the response has come from the United Nations Human Rights Commission, which has ignored dozens of horrific massacres, forced displacements, and other war crimes that were reported all over the world in the past several years. But this week, they formally requested a quick and independent inquiry into the strike in Ain el-Khilawih and other strikes that Israel has carried out against Hezbollah this year. Here at TBN Israel, we will continue to report on every development in this issue, so keep spreading the truth, share, and above all, do not forget to subscribe to TBN Israel so that you never miss another episode of Boots on the Ground. Now, let's move to a report by TBN Israel's senior Middle East analyst Mati Shoshani. Mati, Qatar has entered the fray between Israel and Hamas as negotiations over the Gaza are moving up a level behind the scenes. Against the background of the release of the fallen hostage, a senior delegation of mediators from Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey met in Cairo this week to discuss the implementation of the second stage of the ceasefire in Gaza. According to reports from these meetings, a major topic of discussion was, as they put it, the response to the violations that Israel is committing. And meanwhile, sources familiar with the Gaza file are skeptical that a stabilization force will be established and describe the American difficulty in assembling it, saying Azerbaijan has already withdrawn. In the end, Israel will have to dismantle the organization's weapons by itself. So Mati, give us a bit more about what's happening in the power games in the Middle East, because this week, President Erdogan of Turkey was shocked to discover that his great friend ran a spy network against him. So, what is Erdogan's deep and troubling involvement in the continuation of the Trump plan in Gaza, the entrenchment in Syria, and the distribution of weapons to the non-state actors and Israel's red lines in all of this situation? Also, Mati, what can you tell us about reports that the private meeting at the White House between Trump and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman included some tense moments when the subject of normalization with Israel came up? So, over to you, Mati.
That's right, Yair. Qatar has now once again fully entered the negotiation, the game, the play that's taking place here in the Middle East, as of course have the Egyptians, and as of course have the Turks. We're once again seeing a week of turmoil, of drama, and over the next couple of minutes, we're going to break everything that's been happening down in the Middle East. Over the past weeks, we've seen the US, that started off very, very strong in rebuilding what was happening in the Gaza Strip, truly struggle to maintain the relationships and the incredibly tenuous balance of power that is existing in the Gaza Strip, specifically as it relates to the ceasefire agreement. Now here's what's been happening. There's been an ongoing discussion, specifically with the Qataris, as to how we can make sure Hamas doesn't continue to violate the ceasefire agreement. The problem is Qatar is not entirely sure by their, and I'm saying this based on their actions, whether or not they're on the Israeli side of the violations or the Hamas alleged violations of the agreement. And they're moving in between those two parts. The US on its side of this negotiation, of this discussion, they pulled in the Qataris, they pulled in the Egyptians, and they pulled in the Turkish government to negotiate this next phase, to make sure Hamas stops violating the ceasefire agreement in the Gaza Strip, and to ensure, and this is a big one, that some kind of force is able to govern on the ground inside the Gaza Strip in the day after. And this has really been the tricky and most difficult part of this entire negotiation, this entire phased out system that is being implemented in the Gaza Strip, is answering the question of what happens in the day after Hamas. There still is not an apparent solution to that exact question. So let's break down what's happened in recent days, in recent weeks in the Gaza Strip. There's been a lot happening on the ground. So the first thing is the Qataris, together with the Egyptians, together with the Turkish government and the Americans, of course, meet to negotiate and discuss how the Gaza Strip will be rebuilt and who this ISF force will be made up from. To remind you, the ISF is the International Stabilization Force, which is supposed to be a multiplicity of countries, multiple countries working together to rebuild the Gaza Strip. The biggest question, the biggest challenge up to this point was the question of, in the near future, who has boots on the ground in the Gaza Strip that is in the IDF. And last week and the week before that, two main candidates were proposed. The first were the Azerbaijanis, and the second were the Indonesians. And right now it seems like the Azerbaijan government is very much teetering back and forth on this question of whether or not they're willing to put soldiers on the ground in the Gaza Strip. The reason, of course, is that any Muslim or Arab country that has forces in the Gaza Strip might end up having its own soldiers killing Hamas terrorists, or its own soldiers being killed by Hamas terrorists. And that, from a very, very obvious political stance, is hugely problematic to any such country. And that brings us to the next question. If those countries have trouble putting anyone on the ground, putting boots on the ground with guns in their hand, what really happens in the Gaza Strip? And that's where we are today. We're at a place today where the Israeli IDF, where the IDF has to continue fighting on the ground against Hamas on an ongoing basis. It seems like also something very dramatic has happened, unrelated to the actual physical presence on the ground, which is the level of resolve, specifically when it comes to the Qataris, as to fighting to make sure that the Hamas is removed from the Gaza Strip. And I want to remind you that the Qatari government, well, they've played a very two-faced game for many years as it relates to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the ideological movement behind Hamas. They, on the one hand, speak against Hamas and against terrorism. On the one hand, they work with Israel, they work with the US, and at the same time, with the same breath, they've been funding Hamas for many years. And they too spread a huge amount of false propaganda through their news outlet, which is Al Jazeera, specifically in the Arabic language, although even their impact in the English language is very, very dramatic. They don't just recognize that the Hamas is violating the ceasefire agreement, they've started siding with Hamas and saying, no, the problem actually is that Israel is the one violating the ceasefire agreement. Maybe we should pressure Israel in this whole equation. And that conversation has pulled into it also the Egyptians and also the Turks. And the Turks are also this very, very problematic entity, this very problematic force in the region, who on the one hand says they want to be part of the ISF, the International Stabilization Force, and at the other hand are a destabilizing force in Israel's northern border in Syria, and a government that repeatedly and actively calls for attacks against Israel, calls for Israeli officials to be shot out of the air as they fly over the airspace of Turkey. And then you come to the United States. Their goal here has been, and continues to be, we want to stabilize what's happening in the Gaza Strip, because that will be testament of our ability to stabilize the Middle East. The whole move that's taking place in this region is tied to the fact the United States needs to first finish the war in Gaza, stabilize Lebanon, stabilize Syria, and then the entire region gets pulled into this conversation of stability and ongoing peace and rebuilding efforts versus more of the violence and instability that has existed for so many years because specifically of the Iranian involvement. And we'll get to that in 1 second. So let me break down what we've been talking about. We've been talking about the Qataris and their very complicated relationship here. We've been talking about the negotiations and the discussions that have pulled in the Egyptians and the Turks and the very complicated role that the Turkish government and Turkish people play in everything that's happening here. Now we get to the big players. The big players being the United States, being Hamas, and being Israel after that. So first of all, the goal of the United States and everything that's been happening here remains the same. They want to stabilize, they want to rebuild, and that all starts with the ability to do something new in the Gaza Strip, the ISF, or whatever name it ends up taking, that will be a rebuilding force, a stabilizing force, and a force that is able to do something without Hamas being present. And to do that, they desperately need the Qataris, the Egyptians, and someone else to put boots on the ground in the Gaza Strip that are not the IDF. Because without that, everything that unfolds after this simply won't take place. Without a different force that is not the IDF enforcing the ceasefire agreement in the Gaza Strip, we're back at square one with the IDF continuing to fight. So it has to be someone else. It has to be the Azerbaijanis, it has to be the Indonesian, or someone else on the ground carrying out that mission. Now don't get me wrong, the United States has been putting very substantial efforts into rebuilding and building out this ISF coalition. They've been on the ground in Israel in the Kiryat Gat facility, which is sort of the command module of everything that's going to take place later on in the Gaza Strip. That's been going on full speed in a very substantial way. Those negotiations, those discussions, that ability to pull in other players, that hasn't stopped. But really the deciding moment was and will be the ability to create a new force in the Gaza Strip that is not the IDF. And up to this point, we simply have not seen that. There's one more big piece on the table. Gaza is not an isolated event. We have an ongoing problem with what's happening in Lebanon. We've reported on this extensively over the last weeks, but just to make it very, very short, Hezbollah continues to fight and try to rearm itself in southern Lebanon. And the IDF has continued to strike against Hezbollah targets to prevent them from rearming and rebuilding their terrorist organization. That culminated in a moment just this week where we struck and eliminated the number 2 individual within the Hezbollah organization. By the way, you've heard this before, there have been many number 2s in the Hezbollah organization that have been eliminated by the IDF because they continue refilling their ranks. And really in this situation, this scenario too, the only problem is that you have to solve Lebanon as a country, not just Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Until the Lebanese government is stabilized and is able to push out Hezbollah terrorists altogether and weaken their position within the country, we won't be able to stop fighting against Hezbollah, and by an extension, Israeli forces can't withdraw fully from Lebanon because we can't trust the ceasefire to continue. Because behind the scenes, the Iranians continue pulling the strings of the terrorist organizations and the different proxy forces in this region. So there has to be an all-comprehensive solution. There has to be a move that is regional. There has to be a move that is more than just a tactical solution on the ground. It has to be regional. It has to involve other forces. And at the same time, the US over the next days and weeks needs to pull into the fold the Qataris, the Turks, the Egyptians, and make sure that someone on the ground who isn't the IDF is fighting against Hamas. Because until that moment, the IDF continues to fight on the ground in Gaza Strip, and until that moment, the Lebanese government and the Lebanese army are able to fully remove and weaken Hezbollah, we continue to have on the ground in southern Lebanon an Israeli military presence. That's where we are today. Once again, it's a time for prayer. It's a time to believe that God will prevail with faithfulness in what's happened in this region. But again, yet another complicated week that's taking place here in the Middle East. And as always, it's time to pray for leadership, for boldness, for bravery on the side of our leaders and by the members of our country. Now back to Yair Pinto.
So thank you very much, Mati Shoshani, for bringing us your usual clarity in these vitally important issues. Here at TBN Israel, we will continue to report on every development in this matter, so keep spreading the truth, share, and follow us. And most importantly, do not forget to click the subscribe button so that you stay tuned to the truth in real time and never miss another episode of Boots on the Ground. Now, we're switching our focus to Iran, where the Revolutionary Guards Corps responded to the elimination of Hezbollah's Chief of Staff, Haytham Tabtabi. A little-known fact is that besides Tabtabi being a senior figure in the Iranian Axis, he's also an Iranian citizen who Iran sees as his elimination as a blow to itself, personally as a country. In a statement by the organization, it was written, amongst other things, the revenge for the elimination of Hezbollah's Chief of Staff, Haytham Tabtabi, will be carried out at the appropriate time. They further threatened that the response will be hard and painful. So, to make a brief comment on this threat, it is the latest in a long line of such threats that Iran has made over the years. I'm not yet 40 years old, and I've already heard literally hundreds of such statements by Iran's leaders. But no matter how many times they make the same statement, the appropriate time that their painful response is supposed to happen never seems to materialize. But we are ready for any kind of response here in Israel. And our daily viewers of Boots on the Ground know that I often quote a friend of mine who says, "Talk is cheap, especially in the Middle East." And these empty threats by Iran against Israel are by far the best example of this phenomenon. They're not the only ones who talk a lot but never follow through, but they're the ones who do it in the most, frequently of times, and they seem to expect everybody to keep taking them seriously, which is very strange if you ask me. Ironically, Hezbollah is much less inclined to make empty threats, and so the fact that they have not yet explicitly said that they will respond to the assassination of their chief of staff is actually significant. However, there is also the possibility that the Houthis in Yemen will seek to respond to Tabtabi's elimination because he was very popular amongst the Houthis due to all the assistance that he provided them from the last several years. In this war, Israel has knocked out many of the Houthis' most powerful assets, including several of their senior leadership, but they do not appear to be deterred from continuing to act against us. And future action against Israel or Israeli interests in the Red Sea area, chiefly ships that are sailing to the port of Eilat in the south of Israel and passing through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, are expected to come. It is important to emphasize that alongside their close relations with Tabtabi, senior Houthi figures have previously threatened that they would not hesitate to attack Israel if it expands its strikes against Hezbollah out of their expansive conception of themselves as defenders of the axis of resistance. The combination of the ceasefire in Gaza on the one hand and the intensified Iranian presence in the Yemeni capital on the other may indicate that the Houthis are not resting on their laurels and are also seeking to prepare for the next round against Israel and to arrive at it with renewed forces and more significant capabilities with the aim of inflicting sustainable damage. On the other hand, a report this week in the British news portal The Telegraph, Iran has lost operational control over the Houthis in Yemen and is struggling to maintain the integrity of the remaining axis of resistance forces all across the Middle East. Sources quoted in the report described how the rebels in Yemen, who regularly attack international shipping lanes, have stopped taking orders from Tehran. Another senior Iranian official noted that the Houthis have gone out of control and are now behaving like rebels in every aspect, while listening to Tehran much less than in the past. The trend is not limited to Yemen alone, and certain militia groups in Iraq are also operating independently, ignoring explicit Iranian directives to stop military training until the regional situation calms. However, the current crisis leaves the Houthis as Iran's last significant proxy force after Israel destroyed Hezbollah's top command and what remains of Hamas has been cut off due to the siege on Gaza, and Iranian officials admitted that the clerks in Tehran know that they have lost the game and were even absent from the Gaza ceasefire talks in Sharm el-Sheikh. The collapse of control over the proxies constitutes a fundamental change in the regime's regional posture, forcing Tehran to contend with the unraveling of a 4-decade strategy based on projecting power via proxies. This makes it both easier but also more difficult for Israel to confront the Houthis, who, as already mentioned, are expected to renew their attacks sooner or later. And now, let's move to a topic that is taking place in the United States, but first, I want to invite you to continue in spreading the truth, share, follow us, and most importantly, do not forget to share this content with as many people as possible so that everybody will know what's happening in Israel, the truth, and how to pray for the situation. So the President of the United States signed an executive order this week instructing his administration to determine whether to designate branches of the Muslim Brotherhood as foreign terrorist organizations. In an interview with the media portal Just the News, Trump has already declared that the United States will now act to outlaw the Muslim Brotherhood movement, and a few weeks earlier, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that the department is working on the designation. The designation did not come out of nowhere, but after more than 3 decades in which a deep Islamist infrastructure of the Muslim Brotherhood was built in the United States of America. This infrastructure has been gradually exposed, some of it in federal investigations, some on campuses, and some in community projects. To understand the 2025 crossroads, we must return to the point at which the American administration first understood what it was facing. The Holy Land Foundation was a non-profit organization operated as an Islamic charity in the United States, but in practice, the organization served as an arm that collected tax-deductible American donations and funneled them to Hamas via an octopus-like network of money laundering under the organization's control. In May 2009, the federal court in Dallas handed out heavy prison sentences to the 5 directors of this charity. Americans suddenly understood that the model was simple and dangerous. U.S. citizens donated money legally, received a tax credit, and then the money was transferred directly to the Hamas movement in Gaza and to operational networks that are connected to it. This was the first operational proof that the Muslim Brotherhood sees the United States not only as a place for local charity activity, but as a vast source of funding for spreading Islamist influence in the United States, but also around the world. It is no secret that a lot of other funding for this project comes from Qatar, which has vast wealth from its natural gas businesses and does not need to spend much of that money on its own domestic population, which is tiny. Therefore, they can afford to invest enormous amounts of money in other things, and the project to spread the Muslim Brotherhood's influence all over the world is one of their favorite things. This is done through a network of charitable foundations, digital banks, and media channels which funnel a variety of resources to movements affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, including activists and movements that are located in the United States of America. In Gaza, Hamas, the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, serves as an operational model. Hamas is the proof that ideology, funding, and international connections can create a stable governing structure based on the Muslim Brotherhood. In the United States, the Muslim Brotherhood operates through umbrella organizations, not under the movement's official name. And these umbrella organizations include AMP, American Muslims for Palestine. It is a group that produces content, activist frameworks, training curricular, propaganda, and grassroots infrastructure, and this is the ideological hothouse of the Muslim Brotherhood. Chair is the Council on American Islamic Relations. It is a legal media body that exerts pressure, threatens lawsuits, intimidates institutions, and protects student organizations that carry out anti-Western activity. Next is SJP, the notorious Students for Justice in Palestine organization. This is the main activist body on university campuses. It is responsible for demonstrations, silencing lectures, anti-Israel campaigns, and the injection of social justice discourse rooted in values of intersectionality, which connects dozens of groups that do not share common values but share a common enemy, which in our unfortunate case is Jews and Zionism and Israel, but it also includes Christians, just not as explicitly. Together, these institutions share a combined strategy of presenting a social justice narrative about the need to liberate Palestine, so to speak, while simultaneously injecting an Islamist agenda into every institution that they touch. This is complemented by another phenomenon which even many Western liberals find difficult to understand, and it is commonly known as the Red-Green Alliance. progressive groups, including LGBTQ movements, have somehow been talked into supporting the Islamist agenda, which, aside from a shared opposition to Israel, takes the opposite stance on almost every single social, cultural, political, and economic issue. The ultimate manifestation of this insane situation is the notorious Queers for Palestine group, which ignores the fact that Hamas has a record of torturing and publicly executing homosexuals, while Tel Aviv in Israel, a city in Israel, is one of the most gay-friendly cities in the entire world. However, the answer that Queers for Palestine gives is that a shared enmity towards a perceived oppressor can generate displays of solidarity, which sprout mainly through the ability to penetrate campuses and left-wing organizations via intersectionality, an idea that unites all minority groups under a banner of struggle against oppressors. Thus, queer activists and human rights organizations find themselves cooperating with movements that hold a theocratic position that does not recognize any of their rights. Furthermore, entire cities in the United States of Michigan and neighborhoods of many other cities in other states have come under the domination of Muslim Brotherhood affiliated political groups. This has led to the establishment of Sharia law in some places, backed by public funds, which is explicitly forbidden in the United States Constitution and most state constitutions as well. This situation has led to a growing alarm, and in Texas, a state that sanctifies an absolute separation between religion and state, such projects was perceived as an attempt to create a religious legal enclave. Therefore, last week, Governor Greg Abbott signed a law declaring the Muslim Brotherhood and CAIR as terrorist organizations in the state of Texas and preventing them from purchasing land, amongst other things. This was followed this week by actions at the federal level by Donald Trump, the President of the United States. What is happening now in the United States is not a one-off phenomenon. It is a slow, belated response to the Muslim Brotherhood's methods that was built over 3 decades and included action in the fields of education, infrastructures, communities, institutions, campuses, charities, international fundings, and community projects. All of this was meant to lead to cultural, political, and legal influence for the Brotherhood, and it had a great deal of success. There have been warnings about this growing threat for a very long time, and the year 2025 could yet be the year in which the United States finally not only identifies the plan, but begins to dismantle it. So, we need to stand together and keep spreading the truth. But most importantly, we need to pray, because this is a spiritual war. So let's pray for wisdom to our leaders, to the leaders of the United States dealing with this phenomenon, to our IDF soldiers for their safety. Let's pray for the Israelis that are still trying to gather up and rebuild after 2 years of war and still are fighting on multiple fronts. Let's pray for our enemies not to succeed in their plans against us and to have God's love in their heart. Let's pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
Hello, this is Mati here in Jerusalem with TBN Israel.
This is Yair Pinto from TBN Israel here in Jerusalem. TBN Israel is keeping viewers informed with Israel-focused news, culture, and what God is doing in this land.
Support TBN Israel today online at tbn.org/Israel. Thank you.